India Legal makes the difference because we bring you only the news that counts.
India Legal, stories that count.
Hello and welcome to another special readout from India Legal magazine. As you know, we are the nation's first political legal independent weekly, focusing on controversial issues of national and international importance. The video readouts we present to you are regularly the editorial team's choice of the most significant stories we believe should receive close scrutiny and wide circulation. You can watch them along with the visuals or listen to them as you would a podcast. In this week's readout, we focus on a new kind of violence that seems to have engulfed the world: the violence of hate speech. The adage that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never harm me, cannot be further from the truth. The violence of words is as devastating, as toxic, as lethal as physical harm, and often causes more lasting damage. It provokes enmity, vindictiveness, victimhood, revenge, and wars. And India is not free from hate speech. It is indeed wallowing in it, even exulting in it. It emanates from media platforms. It reverberates in the political arena. TV anchors, newsroom politicians, so-called social activists have turned into demagogues. Their utterances have led to bloodshed and violence. The public, it seems, eagerly absorbs and relishes the language of hatred and vilification rather than the language of love. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony's friends, Romans, countrymen phrase, to address and persuade his detractors, has no purchase with today's mobs. They seem to hunger and slaver over pejoratives and cuss words for opponents. India's ancient Vedic language, Sanskrit, had hardly any gutter cuss words. That's why it was called the Devavani, the language of the gods. And yet, the Vedas are full of opposing views and argumentative disagreements between sages and seers. Today's nasty linguistic flourishes from public platforms could perhaps be described as Rakshasavani, the language of the demons. In this readout, I will not go into the spiritual or metaphysical aspects of fighting this curse in the way Mahatma Gandhi may have sought to confront it. Rather, I will focus on the temporal or civic approach to confronting this malaise from the viewpoint of a republican form of government committed to delivering justice and liberty, including freedom of speech for all citizens. In India, this phenomenon finally caught the attention of the Supreme Court. Its judges made scathing remarks about the government and the media. India Legal recently aired a special show hosted by APN News Editor-in-Chief Rajshri Rai. An experienced and thoughtful panel of experts analyzed the epidemic of hate speech and how government and society can act in protecting the national fabric from its toxic fallout. And this was reported by our senior editor Sanjay Raman Sinha. The Supreme Court's observations had followed hearings on petitions on hate. Referring to television channels, the courts asked whether the government will remain a silent spectator and whether the centre intends to enact anti-hate speech laws as has been recommended by the Law Commission. The court said mainstream media or social media channels are without regulations and have become a platform for inflammatory content. The bench consisted of Justices K.M. Joseph and Justice Rishikesh Roy. They said there is a need to develop an institutional mechanism to deal with hate speeches. The need to frame specific laws also arises from the fact that there is a lack of clarity as to what exactly constitutes hate speech. Now, there are 7 laws which are used to deal with hate speech in the country, but none of them defines hate speech. In fact, the Law Commission in its 267th report had stressed the need to define hate speech. Ved Bhushan, former IPS Indian Police Service officer, he spoke from his ground experience, and I quote him. It's interesting what he said. I will tell you from my experience, when I was in service, we filed cases in hate speech incidents under various acts. Sadly, most of the cases could not be completed. Many cases had political implications and many involved strong political connections. This is how it works. Then there is ambiguity in definition of hate cases. Take the example of the two Dharam Sansads. These were the so-called religious organizations that met in Hardwar and elsewhere, in which they heaped scorn on minorities and even asked for violence to be done, openly for violence to be done against them. One, as I said, was held in Hardwar and the other was held in Uttarakhand. Delhi police had filed a closure report in the Supreme Court in which it said that no hate speech was delivered in the Delhi Dharam Sansad. Clearly, vagueness in definition makes prosecution weak. The Nupur Sharma case, which has gained worldwide notoriety, not only in the Middle East, not only in Muslim nations, but also in Europe and in the US, because Ms. Sharma apparently made derogatory remarks about the Prophet, or the Paigambar as he is called by in Islam. Now, this was a classic example. The other one is one of the Imam of Jama Masjid, against whom many warrants have been issued, but he is yet to be arrested. Now, this is the complicity of politics which makes conviction in hate speech matters difficult. Quote, unquote. Till now, even the courts have not been seen to give strict punishment on hate speeches. There have been many instances where verdicts were too lax or too lenient. First, the seminal Supreme Court verdict on regulation of hate speech in the 2014 Pravasi Bhalai Sangathan versus the Union of India judgment was based on the premise of protection of marginalized communities and not on its negative impact on public order and morality. The court did not go beyond the purview of existing law to penalize hate speech, as that would amount to judicial overreach. That's what the court said. The court further observed that the implementation of existing laws would solve the problem of hate speech to a great extent. In fact, apprehension that laying down a definite standard for hate speech might lead to curb on free speech has prevented the judiciary from defining hate speech in India. Take another instance, that of Amish Devgan versus the Union of India. Here, the Supreme Court has recognized the damage caused by hate speech. However, Devgan was granted interim protection against arrest on the ground that he cooperates with the ongoing investigation into the perceived threats. Justice Sudhir Agarwal, former judge of Allahabad High Court, said, this was during this program that we had on APN TV. He said during this program, "It is true that hate speech is not defined in the law, nor has the United Nations defined it. Yet hate speech is considered as a crime the world over. However, I don't agree fully with the contention that law pertaining to hate speech is not adequate. Take, for instance, the Indian Penal Code, IPC, where there are many provisions to book a hate speech accused. Similarly, in the Representation of People's Act, there are provisions for action against hate speech offenders. The offender can be disqualified for giving a speech promoting enmity between two groups. This has actually happened several years ago in the case of Sanjay Gandhi, for example. That's the example that comes immediately to mind. Cable TV Regulation Act has also provision for hate speech offences. Cinematography Act also has provisions. The fact of the matter is that law enforcement agencies are lax when it comes to taking action against hate speech offenders. Now, this is more so because the offenders have strong political connections. Judge Agarwal repeats what was said earlier, because obviously this is a common thread that runs through the rampant rise of hate speech, the protection that these hate mongers get. The relationship of social media and hate speech is also incriminating. Now, how social media has become involved in this entire hate speech episode is clear from the fact that 2018 was called the year of online hate. Facebook said in its transparency report that it had to remove 3 million hate speech posts. YouTube in the same year had to remove 25,000 inflammatory videos in a month. In the third quarter of 2020, there were 22 million posts on Facebook and 3.5 million posts on Instagram were removed. These data gain significance in the context that even now there is no law in the country to regulate the social media platforms from disseminating hate speech and communally sensitive content. IT and expert advocate Pawan Duggal, a frequent writer for India Today and a participant in our programs, he explained, and I quote Pawan Duggal, "This is the age of fake news and fake content. I agree that we lack concrete laws to handle hate speech. We need a new docket of laws for effective restrictions on hate speech, on this menace of hate speech. I feel sad when I see IT laws 2000. It is silent on hate speech. Some regulations should have been included to make the law an omnibus and relevant, but some provisions of IPC like 468 and 469 should have been included in some form. If documents are made by forgery and used electronically, it can be used for fake news. India has not learned its lesson from countries like Malaysia and Singapore, where there are strict laws for fake news dissemination. In India, it is taken for granted and illegal action is lax." So says Pawan Duggal. Now, the Nupur Sharma episode, which I explained earlier, has cast aspersions on the role of the media and the alleged complicity of television channels to host communally pugnacious debates and debaters, and a lax moderator, or a moderator who sometimes quietly supports the hate content and encourages it, which is even worse. The Supreme Court had also questioned the role of TV media in giving space to hate mongers in their debates. Senior journalist Dr. Rakesh Pathak said, and I quote him, "The four states of democracy have somewhere stumbled in the area of hate speech control and regulation. The most irresponsible actor has been the media. It has become the carrier of hate speech, and especially social media, an unregulated menace. The judiciary also can't wash its hands off laxity in pursuing well-connected hate speech offenders. Just because someone smiles when delivering venom-laden speech doesn't mean that he is guileless of hate or a hate speech crime. The observation of judges on hate speech should find its way in the written order as well. Now, the media has editorial responsibilities. Whenever hate speech gets raked up in TV discussions, the anchor or moderator should immediately stop this diatribe, this vicious, poisonous diatribe. The newspaper should keep a strict vigil on articles and news reports which inadvertently or purposely create a spectre of intergroup animosity." Unquote. All dissent is not hate speech, by the way. In the landmark Shreya Singhal case, the court struck down, and rightly so, Section 66A of the Information Technology Act of 2000, which made the vague offence of sending false, offensive, or inconvenient messages punishable with 3 years imprisonment. However, despite abrogation of Section 66A, police authorities have continued to file FIRs and make arrests under Section 66A all over the country. The National Crime Records Bureau's data showed that over 1,300 cases were filed under the provision, even after a judgment. Distressed? In 2019, Supreme Court directed the union and state governments to sensitize the police about the Shreya Singhal case. Clearly, curbing hate speech mongering is not as much about changing laws as it is about political and institutional will. Very often, the same people who will condemn hate speech from one political party will actually insist that the most draconian laws be instituted against people who disagree with their political point of view, not necessarily for hate speech, but who will curb dissent. And the development of a moral compass, this is very important in terms of tackling hate speech. The onus is firmly as much on all of us as on the four pillars of democracy to take responsibility and join hands to wage love rather than hate. This is your host, editor Inderjit Badhwar. I'll see you again in another video. Until next time, goodbye for now.
India Legal, stories that count.